As the pandemic rips through the world, shattering national health systems and economies, a global response to help pick up the pieces has never been more essential. But international cooperation has sagged under the weight of the coronavirus. The United Nations, the World Health Organization and the G20, all unable to take the lead. Countries have closed themselves off, each locked into a contest to secure supplies of limited resources like face masks, protective clothing and medication. But how it is now is not how it has to be. The pandemic remains a chance for countries to come together and create opportunity from crisis. So, will they? How will the world look after all this? Welcome to COVID-19 Special here on DW News. I'm Chris Colbert in Berlin. It is good to have you with us. Now, when looking at what the future might bring, it's good to remember what Shakespeare once said. Past is prologue, meaning looking back can help one look ahead. Now, the Dutch historian Rutger Bregman has made a career looking at the great crises of the past millennia. He's concluded that they've always led to major interventions and eventually beneficial shifts. For him, the coronavirus calamity has shown the kind of solidarity that humanity is capable of, heralding positive changes for greater society. So let's bring in the man himself, historian Rutger Bregman. It's good to have you on the program. In your new book, Humankind, A Hopeful History, you say that empathy, compassion and kindness make us human beings. Now, how do people hoarding toilet paper, buying bulk loads of noodles and spreading fake news during the current crisis fit into that argument?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, there's this old theory within Western culture, and scientists call it veneer theory. It's the idea that civilization is only a thin veneer, and that as soon as something happens, say a natural disaster, tsunami, or an earthquake, or a pandemic, that people go back to their true selves, and that they show who they really are, and that they're basically selfish, right? Animals, beasts. So they start hoarding stuff and they panic, etc., etc. This is a very popular story in the media. You see it always after natural disasters, you know, think about Katrina, 2005.
Well, it's what people have been experiencing too, isn't it? It's what people have been experiencing.
I think pretty much the opposite, actually. I think it's pretty much the opposite. So if you zoom out a little bit, I think the vast majority of the behavior that we see right now is pro-social in nature. You really see an explosion of cooperation and kindness on the local level. And sure, there is some panic buying, there is some hoarding. But even there, I mean, I'd love to talk about toilet paper, by the way, because the fascinating thing is that most of the toilet paper shortages was just a supply delivery problem, right? So there are two kinds of toilet paper, commercial toilet paper and the toilet paper that you use at home, right? Yeah. So the kind of toilet paper that you use at an office is different from what you use at home. And suddenly there's this huge increase in demand of, you know, the toilet paper that you use at home because people are at home. So they go to the toilet at home. So obviously, I mean, that's the reason why there was suddenly such a shortage. But what we tend to do, because this is such an old idea within our culture, is to say, oh, that must be because of selfishness and hoarding. And sure, there's a little bit of that. But I think if you zoom out and if you look at the science we have on this, you find that actually most behavior is pro-social in nature, and people are actually helping each other.
So what specific signs of a change for the better do you see?
Okay, so what we have seen in the past 15 to 20 years is that there has been a kind of silent revolution within different scientific disciplines. So whether you talk about anthropology or archaeology or psychology or sociology, all these scientists have moved to a much more hopeful view of human nature. And the fascinating thing is that they often don't even know from each other. So, for example, biologists have been arguing in the past couple of years that we have evolved to be friendly. They literally call this survival of the friendliest, which means that for millennia, when we were nomadic hunter-gatherers, it was actually the friendliest among us who had the most kids, and so the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation. But psychologists have been discovering something very similar. You know, for example, they've studied the behavior of people during an emergency, say someone's drowning or attacked in the streets. And based on real evidence from CCTV footage, they find that in 90% of all cases, people actually help each other. So it's very much the opposite of what, say, the news or our culture or the Hollywood movies always tell you.
Okay, Rutger, you also claim that The era of neoliberalism has come to an end thanks to the coronavirus. Why?
Well, I don't know if you've seen the editorial in the Financial Times, from 2 weeks ago. This is the biggest, maybe one of the most powerful newspapers in the globe. And even the Financial Times is saying right now in an editorial that there needs to be an end to the policy direction of the last 40 years. And that for 40 years, we've relied on values like individualism and selfishness. And, the central idea of, what most people call the neoliberal era is the idea that most people are selfish. And in the midst of a pandemic, you realize that that's not going to get you anywhere. And what has been happening is that ideas that just 5-6 years ago were seen as crazy and very unrealistic are now moving into the mainstream. The idea of wealth taxes, basic income, a bigger role for the state. All these ideas are becoming much more prominent right now.
Rutger Bregman, historian. And we certainly hope that you're making the case for a better society after the pandemic does come to. Rutger, thank you so much for talking to us.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Well, from picturing what the world will look like after the pandemic on to the issues of the here and now, the questions you've been sending us about the coronavirus. And there are so many, our science editor, Derek Williams, hardly gets to leave his home office.
If you've had COVID-19 and recovered, do you still need to wear a mask?
Although the effectiveness of wearing a mask as a measure to prevent you from catching COVID-19 is still being debated, there's now a pretty broad consensus that it certainly makes sense to wear one if you have the disease, because it will make you less of a danger for others. In theory, if you had the virus and recovered, you shouldn't have to wear a mask for at least a while, because theory says that after fighting off the disease, you should be immune, which means you can no longer produce the virus and infect others, or on the flip side, you cannot be reinfected by others. The problem is that this is all still very much theory, as experts still have too little information about things like the possibility of reinfection. They can't yet make real science-based recommendations about people who have recovered. They need more time to gather data. So if you want to continue to wear a mask even after having COVID-19, I don't think anyone at this point would consider that silly.
When we have a vaccine, will people who have already had COVID-19 be vaccinated as well?
This is an interesting question because it touches closely on the question of immunity to COVID-19, which we still don't know much about. But by the time a vaccine becomes available, which despite a lot of hype, nobody expects to happen before next year, we will have a lot more information about how long your immune response is likely to last when you've had this disease. That will, of course, inform decisions about who needs vaccinations most. What's clear is that if and when they become available, frontline health workers will be the first to be vaccinated. And I imagine that'll include those who have already had the virus, even if they're only given it as a precautionary measure. Depending on what we know by then about the length of the average immune response, it's quite likely, I think, that people who haven't had the disease will be prioritized over those who have had it. But this is all still really hypothetical because we still don't have the data we need on a large number of critical aspects, and any potential vaccines are still quite a way down the road.
Can diet affect how vulnerable you are to COVID-19?
Probably no other factor has more of an impact on your health in the long term than your diet does. I haven't seen any specific scientific studies showing that a particular diet, like a plant-based one, makes you less vulnerable to COVID-19 than any other diet. That would probably be impossible to show anyway in the middle of this pandemic. But there are recommendations that health bodies and doctors are continuing to make pretty much across the board. First and foremost, even though they might not be easy to come by where you live, you should try to eat a range of fresh, unprocessed foods every day. Second, drink plenty of water. And of course, no matter how great the temptation, try to avoid comfort foods loaded with sugar and fat and salt. They might lift your mood temporarily, but in the long run, they won't give your immune system what it needs to put up a fight.